In conclusion, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is a colossal disaster, which, as I noted at the start of my talk, will lead people all around the world to search for its causes. Those who believe in facts and logic will quickly discover that the United States and its allies are mainly responsible for this train wreck. The April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO was destined to lead to conflict with Russia. The Bush administration was the principal architect of that fateful choice, but the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations have doubled down on that policy at every turn, and America's allies have dutifully followed. Even though Russia's leaders made it perfectly clear that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be crossing the brightest of red lines, the United States simply refused to accommodate Russia's deepest security concerns and instead moved relentlessly to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. The tragic truth is that if the West had not pursued NATO expansion into Ukraine, it is unlikely there would be a war in Ukraine today, and Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. In essence, Washington played the central role in leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. History will judge the United States and its allies with abundant harshness for its remarkably foolish policy on Ukraine. Thank you.
Right, so this is what we've been hearing from the intelligence chief in Ukraine, as I mentioned at the top, that now the Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Crimea will be retaken by Ukraine. And here's what Steve Bannon said: the globalists with the Biden regime leading have taken the war from defend Ukraine to liberate Crimea after $100 billion and losing a third of the country to the Russian army. So now this is the new message. Liberate Crimea. Forget defend Ukraine. Is that what we're starting to see now more, this talk? Is that's the new mission?
You know, I'm beginning to think that there was never much coherent strategy to begin with other than we're here to hurt Russia. I mean, that's essentially what we were told. This whole thing has become incoherent now.
Right.
The notion of striking at and liberating, as they say, liberating Crimea is a bunch of nonsense. It's all crazy. And I'm afraid what the Russians are discovering is the only way to put an end to this nonsense is for them to commit 100% to the destruction of the Ukrainian forces and ultimately to the elimination of this regime in Kyiv. Now, they're going to do that, but instead of seeing this sort of massive blitzkrieg that we're accustomed to because of the experience with the Germans in World War II, I think you're talking about 3 or 4 axes where you have effectively meat grinders on each one. Imagine bulldozers that are just moving forward, steamrolling what they find in their path until ultimately everything is gone. This is going to take a little longer, but the Russians want to be absolutely certain that they've annihilated the enemy. That's what we're going to watch. I also think the Russians are very concerned about our impulsiveness. We're in no position to interfere with what they're doing in Ukraine. And this is the reason I wrote this. Again, people need to be warned. This regime in Washington is amateurish. They're ideological and amateurish. They don't really understand what they're up against. They never did. They miscalculated when they thought, well, the Russians are weak. See, they didn't come in there gangbusters the way we would. Well, of course they didn't, because they were dealing with brother Slavs. They didn't want to kill Orthodox Christian Slavs. They were trying to find a way around it. When it became clear there was no alternative, that's when everything changed. So you're going to see the giant meat grinders show up and crush whatever is left in that country. But the more we talk about lashing out, the more we talk about quote unquote liberation or removing Putin or these kinds of things, the worse it's going to get. We got to get out of this business and start coming to terms with reality. But reality is not very popular in Washington. Well, Clayton, back in January, I was interviewed in Washington by Dimitri Simes for one of his programs. And I was asked specifically about NATO. And I said, if we push this and the Russians go in and we fail to negotiate an end to this quickly, this will destroy NATO. Remember, NATO was founded as a defensive alliance. It was never designed for offensive operations.
Right.
There's nothing in the NATO charter about attacking anyone. Everything's about being the object of attack, the victim of attack. We have been trying to use NATO as an offensive weapon since the 1990s. Since stupid people like Senator Lugar in the Senate said, well, either NATO is out of area, in other words, it's going to operate beyond Europe, or it's out of business. And most of us stood around at the time in the military and said, well, maybe it needs to go out of business because there's no reason for it to exist anymore. So we've reinvigorated in our minds the Russian threat. We've provoked it. We succeeded. It's there. But it would be misleading to assume that there is an aspiration to dominate the continent. It's a losing proposition. The Russians know that. That's not what they're about. They're very disappointed in the Germans, who are their principal trading partners, and can't understand why Germany has turned so radically hostile to Russia. There's no reason for it. This is something we're not prepared for. No one in Europe is prepared for this. We're not prepared to mobilize anybody in Western Europe. The only people who've mobilized soldiers at all to this point are the Poles. And the Poles are courageous people. There's no question about it. I think the notion of going to war with Russia at this stage is idiotic. But they also don't have the most modern equipment and capabilities that we do. So even though they can provide numbers, they're not necessarily capable of augmenting us. And we have at most 50,000 combat troops in Europe. At most. We have 100,000 soldiers in Europe. But that doesn't mean combat soldiers. That just means soldiers. In terms of those people that carry the fight to the enemy, that close with and destroy the enemy, that launch rockets, missiles, and ammunition at the enemy, no, we've only got 50,000. We're now looking at a force in and around Ukraine of 700,000 plus, with the potential to go close to 1 million, and new plans to permanently expand the Russian military establishment, especially the army. This is all crazy nonsense. We ought to stop talking about it. We need to get back to understanding the Ukrainians are losing badly. They're taking horrific casualties. A friend of mine who is a demographer got a hold of me and said, look, Doug, at the beginning of this war, there were supposedly 37.4 million people in Ukraine. Says in reality, there were already 2 million Ukrainians working in the United Kingdom and the European Union. And once the war began, over 10 million Ukrainians left. In other words, they packed up their bags and they moved out. 1 million plus went into Russia, the rest went west. Now, if you look at those numbers and then you consider that right now, inside the areas currently controlled by the Russians, there are 4 million so-called Ukrainian citizens. Of course, they're Russians. They speak Russian, they are Russians, and they're living under Russian administration. They're all very happy to have, quote unquote, been liberated. But when you start adding up these numbers, and then you look at the casualties that no one wants to tell the truth about, you're looking at 18 to 22 million people left in Ukraine.
Wow.
Now, Clayton, that's the size of the Netherlands.